The flickering tongue of the torch cast dancing demons against the pines, the only warmth in a world shrinking to the size of a snarling, silver-furred circle. Seraphina's arm ached, the muscles screaming from the strain of holding the burning brand aloft. Behind her, a small body trembled against her legs, the boy's shallow, terrified breaths puffing against the rough denim of her jeans. His name was Cody, a fact she'd learned only minutes before the forest had decided to reclaim them. The alpha wolf, a brute with shoulders like granite and eyes like chips of yellow ice, took a step forward, its lips peeling back from teeth designed to tear and rend. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that vibrated through the frozen ground and up into Seraphina's bones. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. Fear was a luxury she'd discarded years ago in a land of sand and sun, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that now served her as well in this frozen wilderness as it had then. She was a shield, and shields did not break. She shifted her weight, planting her boots more firmly in the thin layer of snow, and thrust the torch forward with a guttural yell that was more animal than human. The flames hissed, spitting embers that made the alpha recoil, but its pack only tightened the circle. They were patient. They knew fire died. They knew flesh grew tired. It was a war of attrition she was destined to lose. The boy, Cody, whimpered, his small hands clutching her pant leg so tightly his knuckles were white. He'd been chasing a rabbit. He'd told her, his eyes wide with the thrill of a childhood adventure just before it curdled into a nightmare. He'd stumbled upon her small, isolated cabin, a ghost of a structure almost swallowed by the mountains, and she'd been in the middle of splitting firewood. Then the howling had started, not distant and mournful, but close. Predatory. Now, the scent of pine and wood smoke was being choked out by the rank, musky odor of hungry carnivores. The alpha tested her again, a feint to her left, and another wolf mirrored the movement on her right. They were intelligent, coordinated. Her gaze darted between them, cataloging threats, assessing weaknesses, her mind falling back on training she prayed every day she would never need again. Triage, threat assessment, asset protection. The asset was the 6-year-old boy cowering behind her. The threat was a dozen sets of teeth. Her only weapon was a dying flame. The torch sputtered, a greasy plume of black smoke signaling its imminent demise. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to pierce the wall of her resolve. She shoved it down. Not now. Not here. Just as the alpha gathered its haunches to spring, a new sound tore through the forest's deadly quiet. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the crackle of a fire. It was a deep, guttural roar, a mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the very trees. It grew louder, a percussive, angry heartbeat that didn't belong in this primordial world. The wolves' ears flattened. Their confident snarls turned to confused whines. The sound was alien, violent. It was the sound of approaching chaos. Headlights cut through the gloom, two piercing beams that sliced through the trees and pinned the wolf pack in their glare. The roar intensified, resolving itself into the unmistakable cadence of a V-twin engine being pushed to its limit. A massive motorcycle, all black steel and gleaming chrome, burst into the clearing, its tires churning snow and frozen earth. The man astride, it was as formidable as his machine. He wore a leather cut, its back emblazoned with the emblem of a skeletal scepter gripped in an iron fist. He swung his leg over the bike before it had even fully stopped, moving with a predator's grace that made the wolves seem like pups. In his hand, he held a large, heavy pistol, but his eyes, flinty and wild with a father's terror, were locked on the small boy behind Seraphina. "Cody!" The man's voice boomed, a gravelly command that echoed the bike's engine. The alpha wolf, caught between this new, louder threat and its cornered prey, let out a final, frustrated snarl before melting back into the shadows. The rest of the pack followed, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. The clearing was suddenly, unnervingly still, the silence broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the boy's ragged sobs. The biker holstered his weapon and strode forward, his heavy boots crunching on the snow. He didn't look at Seraphina. His entire world was focused on the small form that detached from her and ran into his arms. "Dad!" Cody cried, burying his face in the worn leather. The man, a giant of muscle and ink, wrapped his arms around his son, his entire body seeming to sag with relief. He held the boy for a long moment, his face buried in his hair, whispering words of comfort Seraphina couldn't hear. When he finally looked up, his eyes met hers. They were filled with a chaotic storm of gratitude, suspicion, and raw, untamed power. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Seraphina let the torch fall from her numb fingers. It landed in the snow with a final hiss, its light extinguished, plunging them back into the twilight of the forest. "My name is Seraphina," she said, her voice hoarse. "Your son was lost," the man, Jackson Ryder, though she didn't know his name yet, simply nodded, his jaw tight. He scanned her from head to toe, taking in the worn clothes, the soot on her face, the exhaustion in her posture. He was assessing her, the same way she had assessed the wolves, and in that moment, she understood that the danger in this clearing had not entirely passed. It had just changed its shape. He led them back to her cabin, a small, hand-built sanctuary of logs and stone that looked as though it had grown from the mountainside itself. Cody, now wrapped in his father's thick leather jacket, was shivering but safe, his eyes wide as he took in the rustic interior. Jackson, or Jax as he insisted she call him, moved with a restless energy, his presence seeming to shrink the small space. He was the president of the Iron Scepters Motorcycle Club, a fact stated not with pride or apology, but as a simple declaration of identity, like stating his height or weight. He looked around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the neatly stacked books, the carefully tended herbs hanging from the rafters, and the framed, folded flag tucked away on a high shelf. It was a place of quiet solitude, and he had shattered it with his roaring engine and primal fear. "I owe you," he said, the words sounding like they were torn from his throat. "He's all I have," Jack spoke of Cody's mother, taken by a sickness that no amount of toughness or money could fight. His voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, but Seraphina, a connoisseur of pain, could hear the raw wound beneath the surface. It was a wound that mirrored her own. She offered him the last of her coffee, a gesture of peace. As she handed him the steaming mug, her sleeve slid up, revealing a faint, intricate scar on her forearm, a field medic's tattoo, faded but unmistakable. Jax's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition. Before he could ask, a sharp thud from outside made them both jump. Cody flinched, pressing closer to his father. Jax was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. Seraphina moved to the door, peering through the small window. A piece of paper, stark white against the dark wood, was tacked to her door with a vicious-looking nail. She pulled the door open, the cold air rushing in, and wrenched the paper free. It was a formal notice, printed in aggressive block letters. Final warning. It spoke of property lines, zoning violations, and imminent eviction. At the bottom was the stylized logo of Croft Development, a sleek, predatory hawk. "What is this?" Jax asked, his voice a low growl as he read the notice over her shoulder. "It's Silas Croft," Seraphina said, her voice weary. She crumpled the paper in her fist. "He wants this mountain, and I'm in his way." She explained the situation in clipped, concise sentences. Croft, a developer with a reputation for getting what he wanted, had bought up most of the surrounding land for a luxury ski resort. Her small plot, inherited from her grandfather, was the last holdout, a stubborn thorn in the side of his grand design. He'd started with offers, then moved to legal threats, and now, it seemed, to something more direct. Jax listened, his expression hardening with every word. He looked from the eviction notice to the flag on her shelf, then to the fading tattoo on her arm. He was connecting dots, building a narrative. A soldier who came home to find a different kind of war waiting for her. He sent his men before, she admitted, her gaze distant. They said the wolves around here have been getting bolder, hungrier. A chilling silence fell between them. The wolves hadn't just been a random act of nature. They had been a tool. Croft wasn't just trying to evict her. He was trying to terrorize her, using the wilderness itself as a weapon. Perhaps the deer carcass that had drawn the pack so close to her cabin hadn't been an accident. The thought was colder than the wind whistling through the pines. Jax's hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. The debt he felt he owed her had just become entangled with a deep, primal rage against the kind of man who would use a child's life as leverage. "This isn't your fight," Seraphina said firmly, though a part of her was screaming for the help this formidable man so clearly represented. "I can handle Silas Croft." Jax looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fire that rivaled the torch she had wielded. "You saved my son," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "That makes this my fight. That makes this the club's fight." He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving swiftly across the screen. He sent a single text message to a man he called Grizz. "Dig into Silas Croft. Everything. I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, and every dirty secret he's ever had. We're going to war." The message was sent. The gears were in motion. Outside, the forest was quiet again, but a different kind of storm was gathering, one made not of wind and snow, but of leather, chrome, and a Brotherhood's righteous fury. Seraphina stood in the doorway of her small cabin, a fortress that suddenly felt terribly fragile, and watched as the world she had built to keep herself safe from men like Jax was about to be saved by them. The irony was as sharp and cold as the mountain air. She had survived wolves of flesh and blood, but now she had to face the humankind, and she would not be facing them alone. The next morning, Jax was gone, but his promise lingered in the air like the smell of his motorcycle's exhaust. He had insisted on taking Cody home, but not before getting Seraphina's solemn vow that she would call him at the first sign of new trouble. It was a promise she had no intention of keeping. This was her land, her battle. She had fought for her country. She could certainly fight for her home. Yet, a part of her felt the unfamiliar warmth of being cared for, a sensation so foreign it was almost uncomfortable. She spent the day reinforcing her defenses, checking the deadbolts, boarding up a small back window, and cleaning the old hunting rifle her grandfather had left her. Each task was a familiar meditation, a way of imposing order on a world spiraling into chaos. Her body ached from the confrontation with the wolves, a deep, cellular exhaustion that sleep hadn't cured. But as she worked, her mind kept replaying the image of Jax's face when he saw Cody, the raw terror melting into ferocious relief. It was a look she had seen before, in the faces of soldiers finding a lost brother in the middle of a firefight. It was the look of family. Miles away, in the grimy, oil-scented heart of the Iron Scepters clubhouse, Grizz was hunched over a laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating the intricate tattoos that covered his thick arms. Grizz was the club's enforcer, a man whose knuckles were as calloused as his heart was supposed to be. But he was also their unofficial intelligence officer, a surprisingly adept navigator of the digital underworld. Jax's order had been clear, and Grizz attacked the task with the same methodical brutality he applied to a bar fight. Silas Croft, on the surface, was a pillar of the community. He donated to charities, sat on city council boards, and had a smile as polished as his Italian leather shoes. But Grizz wasn't interested in the surface. He dug deeper, peeling back layers of shell corporations, anonymous lawsuits, and hushed-up building code violations. He found a clear pattern. Croft targeted small landowners, people on the fringes, the elderly, the poor, the isolated. He'd offer a pittance, and if they refused, the harassment would begin. Strange noises in the night. Property damage. Anonymous threats. The local sheriff's department, underfunded and stretched thin, often dismissed the complaints as local disputes or petty vandalism. More than one family had sold their property to Croft for a fraction of its worth, just to make the nightmare stop. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Grizz hacked into the financials of a local hunting supply company. A recent, anonymous bulk purchase of deer scent and raw meat, paid for in cash, with delivery instructions to a service road just a mile from Seraphina's cabin. The delivery had been made 2 days before the wolf attack. Grizz leaned back, a grim smile on his face. He had him. It wasn't just harassment. It was a calculated, potentially lethal act of intimidation. He picked up his phone and dialed Jax. "You were right, Prez," Grizz said, his voice a low rumble. "Croft isn't just a snake. He's the kind that lays traps." He explained what he'd found, his words painting a clear, ugly picture. On the other end of the line, the silence was heavy, charged with a building rage. Jax had known Croft was dirty, but this was a different level of evil. Using a wolf pack as a weapon, endangering anyone who might wander into that part of the woods, including his own son. The thought made his blood run cold, then hot. He remembered the look on Seraphina's face, her exhausted defiance as she stood between his child and a dozen snarling predators. She hadn't been just protecting Cody. She had been standing against the darkness Croft had unleashed. His decision was instantaneous. This was no longer just about repaying a debt. This was about justice. It was about drawing a line in the sand. The Iron Scepters didn't start fights, but they damn well finished them. And Silas Croft had just started a war with a family he couldn't possibly comprehend. "Get the boys," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Call a meeting." "Church." Tonight, back on the mountain, the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple. Seraphina sat by her window, the rifle across her lap, watching the shadows lengthen. A flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line caught her eye. Not an animal. It was a man, then another. They were dressed in dark work clothes, their faces obscured by the twilight. They moved with a swaggering confidence, carrying heavy tools that weren't meant for construction. One of them swung a crowbar, shattering the small solar panel she used for electricity. Another took a sledgehammer to her woodpile, scattering the precious fuel for her stove across the snow. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted her to see. They wanted her to feel helpless. Seraphina's grip tightened on the rifle. Her training screamed at her to stay inside, to use the cabin as a defensible position. But the sight of them desecrating her home, her sanctuary, ignited a fury that burned away her fear. This was her ground. She would not be besieged. She chambered around, the metallic click echoing in the small room. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to fight. This time, however, the fight was coming to her, and she was alone. The men laughed as they worked, their voices carrying on the cold, still air. They were enjoying themselves. They were predators, just like the wolves, only they wore human skin. One of them approached the cabin, a canister in his hand. Gasoline. The threat was no longer implied. It was immediate, stark, and smelled of chemical accelerants. He began to splash the liquid on the dry logs of her porch, the place where she sat every morning with her coffee, the only place in the world where she felt a glimmer of peace. That was the final violation. With a cry of pure rage, Seraphina kicked the door open and leveled the rifle, the setting sun glinting off the long barrel. "Get off my land," she snarled, her voice shaking but clear. The men froze, surprised by her sudden appearance. They had expected a terrified woman, not a soldier staring down the sights of a high-powered rifle. The man with the gas dropped it, his eyes wide. For a moment, they were at a stalemate. Then, their leader, a thick-necked brute with a cruel sneer, smirked. "Or what, lady?" he taunted. "You gonna shoot all three of us?" He took a step forward, testing her. It was a fatal miscalculation. He saw a lone woman. He didn't see the years of training, the discipline forged in fire, the unyielding spirit of a warrior who had been pushed too far. He didn't see the silent promise Jackson Ryder had made. And he didn't hear it. Not yet. But it was there, a faint, distant hum on the horizon. The sound of thunder rolling in on a clear night. The sound of a promise being kept. Grizz arrived first, his bike a black blur against the encroaching darkness. He'd been on his way to check on her, a bad feeling gnawing at his gut after his call with Jax. The scene that greeted him was worse than he'd imagined. Seraphina in a standoff, outnumbered, with the reek of gasoline fouling the air. He didn't hesitate. He killed his engine, letting the bike skid to a halt, and vaulted off, a tire iron appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Looks like you boys are a little lost," Grizz rumbled, his voice dripping with menace. "This ain't your property." The three thugs turned, their confidence wavering as they took in the sheer size of him. Grizz was built like a grizzly bear, all muscle and beard, with the club's patch on his back proclaiming his allegiance. He was an altogether different proposition from a lone woman. The leader sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "This is Croft's business." "Piss off, biker," Grizz chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "You see, that's where you're wrong. You made it our business when you threatened a friend of the family." He took a step forward, swinging the tire iron-eyedly. Behind him, the distant hum was growing into a distinct, multi-toned roar. It was the sound of dozens, then scores of V-twin engines, a symphony of internal combustion that was the Iron Scepters battle hymn. The thugs' faces went from pale to ashen. They exchanged panicked glances. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They were bullies, not soldiers. The roar became deafening as a wave of headlights crested the ridge, flooding the clearing with brilliant, accusatory light. Bike after bike poured into the area, surrounding the cabin, their engines rumbling in a unified, intimidating chorus. They formed a circle of chrome and steel, hemming in Croft's men. Jax was at the front, his face a mask of cold fury. He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with grim finality. He walked past Grizz, his eyes locked on the three terrified men. He stopped in front of the leader, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Jax didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity of his words was more terrifying than any shout. "You came to this woman's home," he said, his voice like gravel. "You destroyed her property. You threatened her life. You did this after she saved my son's life." He let the words hang in the air, each one a nail in their coffin. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the 150 bikers who sat on their idling machines, their collective stare of physical weight. "And now, you have to answer to all of us." The night before, the clubhouse had been thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer, a temple of Brotherhood. Jax stood before his men, not as their president, but as a father. He told them everything. He spoke of Cody, lost and terrified. He described Seraphina, a lone warrior standing against a pack of wolves, her only weapon a stick tipped with fire. Then he told them what Grizz had discovered about Silas Croft's campaign of terror, culminating in the deliberate luring of that same wolf pack. He spoke of her service, the flag on her shelf, a symbol of a promise the country had made to its soldiers, a promise of a safe home to return to, a promise that Silas Croft was spitting on. "This woman," Jax had roared, his voice cracking with emotion, "she is what we're supposed to be. She protects the innocent. She stands her ground. She asks for nothing. And this scum, this money-grubbing coward Croft, he thinks he can crush her because she's alone." He paused, letting his eyes meet those of every man in the room. "Well, I'm here to tell you, she is not alone. An attack on her is an attack on the Scepters. It's an attack on my son. It's an attack on our code." A roar of assent shook the building. There was no debate, no hesitation. The code was simple. You protect your own, and you protect those who cannot protect themselves. Seraphina, by her selfless act, had become one of them. She was family. The plan they formed was not one of mindless violence. It was strategic, designed for maximum psychological impact. They would not be a mob. They would be an army. Now, on the mountain, that army had Croft's three pawns cornered. The leader of the thugs dropped the crowbar with a clatter. He raised his hands in surrender. "We were just doing a job," he stammered. Jax's expression didn't soften. "Get on your knees," he commanded. The three men fell to their knees in the snow. Jax nodded to two of his men, who dismounted and efficiently zip-tied the thugs' hands behind their backs. "You're going to deliver a message to your boss," Jax said to the leader. "You're going to tell him that Seraphina's property is now under the protection of the Iron Scepters Motorcycle Club. You're going to tell him that if so much as a single leaf falls on her land without her permission, we will consider it a personal insult. And then you're going to tell him that we are coming for him. Not here. We're going to pay him a visit at his office, where all his respectable friends can see him for what he is." He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. Are we clear? The man nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. The bikers parted a path, and the three men were hauled to their feet and shoved toward their truck. They scrambled inside and peeled away, tires spinning, leaving only the smell of their fear behind. The roar of the engines died down, replaced by a respectful silence. Seraphina stood on her porch, the rifle still in her hands, though now it hung loosely at her side. She looked at the sea of men before her. Their leather-clad forms a fortress wall around her home. They weren't monsters. They were guardians. Jax walked up the steps to her porch. He gently took the rifle from her hands and leaned it against the wall. He looked at her, his hard eyes softening with a profound respect. "I told you this was our fight," he said simply. Seraphina felt a tremor run through her, the release of tension so profound it almost brought her to her knees. For the first time since she'd come home from the war, she didn't have to be the strong one. She didn't have to be the shield. A single tear traced a path through the soot on her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Jax just shook his head. "No, thank you. Now, let's get this place fixed up." The bikers dismounted as one. They were no longer an army. They were a construction crew. They brought out generators from their chase vehicles, flooding the area with light. They began to work, their movements efficient and purposeful. Some began res-tacking her woodpile, their calloused hands making short work of the scattered logs. Others, skilled mechanics and electricians, swarmed her broken solar panel, their quiet murmurs filled with technical jargon. A team led by Grizz started assessing the damage to the cabin itself, planning the repairs. They worked through the night under the cold mountain stars, their camaraderie a tangible thing. They shared coffee and jokes, their dark humor a counterpoint to the serious work they were doing. Seraphina watched them, a feeling of awe washing over her. They were a tribe, a brotherhood bound by more than just a shared patch. They were bound by a code of honor she understood down to her bones. They didn't see her as a victim to be pitted. They saw her as a fellow warrior, one of their own who needed reinforcements. As dawn broke, casting a soft pink glow over the landscape, the work was done. Her woodpile was stacked higher than before. The solar panel was not just repaired, but reinforced. The porch was swept clean of gasoline, the damaged wood replaced. They had even fixed the broken window and reinforced her doorframe. Her small, vulnerable cabin now felt like a stronghold. The ride to Silas Croft's downtown office was a different kind of operation. It wasn't a thunderous charge. It was a slow, deliberate procession. 150 Harleys rolling through the city streets in perfect, tight formation during the morning rush hour. They obeyed every traffic law, their discipline making them even more intimidating. They were not a chaotic mob. They were an unstoppable force. They didn't park in the garage. They filled the entire street in front of Croft Tower, a gleaming glass and steel monument to corporate greed. The sound of their engines, even at an idle, was a low, rumbling earthquake that drew faces to every window. Jax, Grizz, and two other senior members dismounted and walked into the pristine lobby, their boots echoing on the marble floor. The security guards, accustomed to dealing with panhandlers, froze at the sight of them. Jax didn't even glance at them. He walked straight to the receptionist's desk. "Tell Silas Croft that Jackson Ryder is here to see him," he said, his voice calm and level. "We don't have an appointment." The message was relayed, and moments later, Silas Croft himself emerged from an elevator, flanked by two expensive-looking lawyers. He was exactly as Grizz had described him, impeccably dressed, with a predatory smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Ryder," Croft said, his tone oozing false cordiality, "to what do I owe this impressive display?" "We're here to discuss your hostile acquisition of a property on Shadow Mountain," Jax said, his voice cutting through the pretense. "The one belonging to Seraphina." Croft's smile tightened. "That's a private business matter." "I'm afraid I can't." "You can," Jax interrupted, taking a step forward. "Because you made it my business. You made it the Iron Scepters business. You hired thugs to terrorize a combat veteran. You endangered my son's life by using a wolf pack as a scare tactic," He tossed a folder onto the reception desk. It slapped against the polished surface with a loud crack. That's everything Grizz found. The shell corporations. The witness statements from other families you've run off their land. The receipt for the deer meat. Copies have been sent to a few journalists I know who love stories about corporate bullies. And, of course, a copy is waiting for the state police. Should anything unfortunate ever happen to Miss Seraphina or anyone in my club, Croft's face lost all its color. His lawyers began to whisper furiously to him. He had built his empire in the shadows, using fear and plausible deniability. Jax was dragging it all into the blinding light of day, backed by 150 witnesses parked outside. What do you want? Croft hissed, his composure finally cracking. You will drop all legal action against Seraphina, Jax stated, his voice like iron. You will sign over a deed that guarantees her property rights in perpetuity, along with a 20-foot easement on all sides. You will pay for all the damages your men caused, and then you will forget Shadow Mountain ever existed. You will never go near her or her land. Again, he leaned in, his face inches from Croft's. And if you ever use the lives of innocents as leverage again, my friends and I will dismantle your entire world, piece by piece. We will not be filing a lawsuit. The threat was absolute. There was no room for negotiation. Croft looked from Jax's unblinking eyes to the sea of leather and chrome visible through the glass doors. He saw his polished world colliding with a raw, brutal reality he couldn't control. He was a predator who had just run into a bigger, more determined pack. He nodded stiffly, a man defeated. The lawyers immediately began talking about drawing up the paperwork. Jax and his men turned and walked out of the lobby without another word. Their point had been made. As they mounted their bikes, the rumble of their engines was a victory cry. It was the sound of justice, delivered not by a court, but by a code. Back on the mountain, Seraphina wasn't alone. A few of the Scepters had volunteered to stay behind, forming a quiet, respectful guard. They didn't intrude, but their presence was a comfort, a silent promise that she was no longer a lone holdout. She was part of a watch. When Jax returned, he found her on her newly repaired porch, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the sun set. Little Cody was there too, having insisted on coming back with his father. He was carefully building a small fort out of twigs near the steps, occasionally looking up at Seraphina with a shy, adoring smile. Jax handed her a thick legal document. It was the deed, signed and notarized, guaranteeing her rights to this land forever. She took it, her fingers tracing the official seal. It was more than a piece of paper. It was a declaration of freedom. It was peace. I don't know how to repay you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jack sat on the step below her, watching his son play. You already did, he said quietly. You showed my son what a hero looks like. You reminded my men what we fight for. That's a debt we can never fully repay you. He looked out at the mountains, the same peaks that had once represented her isolation and now stood as silent witnesses to her salvation. You know, he said, a rare, small smile touching his lips, we have a prospect program. But I think we just found our first ever honorary member. Seraphina laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like it had been trapped inside her for years. The sound was beautiful. She was no longer just a survivor, a broken soldier hiding from the world. She was a hero. She was a friend. She was family. And as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the mountain, the quiet, protective rumble of a Harley-Davidson engine was the most comforting sound in the world. She had faced down wolves, both animal and human, and in doing so, had found her pack. They weren't the ones she expected, but they were the ones she needed. They were brothers in arms, guardians of the forgotten, and they had ridden to honor one of their own. Let this story be a testament to the fact that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear leather and ride machines of thunder, bound by a code that decency and honor are worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of brotherhood and standing up for the vulnerable, share this story, comment with your own stories of unlikely heroes, and always support those who have fought for our freedom, both abroad and at home.